March 1916. A British raiding party enters a German trench section near Loo in darkness. The lead soldier carries no rifle. In his hands is a 2-foot length of wood studded with 6-inch nails driven through at irregular angles. He encounters a German sentry at a corner junction. The club strikes twice. The sentry makes no sound. The raider moves forward. By the time the patrol withdraws 20 minutes later, 7 men have been killed in near total silence with weapons that did not exist in any army's official inventory. These weapons had no designation codes, no serial numbers, no quartermaster requisitions. They were built by frontline soldiers from scrap materials found in the ruins of industrial France and Belgium. They killed more men in close-quarters trench fighting than any regulation sidearm, and most were destroyed or discarded before the war ended because no army wanted evidence that such things had been necessary. The problem facing all combatant armies by late 1914 was spatial. Trench warfare created engagement environments that existing weapons could not address effectively. Trenches were narrow, often less than 4 feet wide, with sharp turns every 10 to 15 meters to limit blast effects and prevent enfilade fire. Fighting in these spaces occurred at distances measured in feet. The standard infantry rifle was designed for engagements at ranges exceeding 300 meters. Inside a trench, a rifle was nearly useless. The bolt action was too slow when enemies appeared suddenly around corners. The length of the weapon, typically 40 to 45 inches, made it impossible to bring to bear quickly in confined spaces. Bayonets helped, but required thrust with the full length of the rifle, which demanded more space than most trenches provided. Handguns were effective but rare. Most soldiers did not carry pistols. Those who did found that pistol ammunition often failed to stop attackers immediately, particularly when heavy wool uniforms and leather equipment absorbed much of the bullet's energy. What soldiers needed was a weapon optimized for immediate, silent killing at arm's length in complete darkness. The weapon needed to function when caked in mud, require no ammunition, and deliver trauma sufficient to incapacitate instantly without producing noise that would alert nearby enemy positions. No such weapon existed in military arsenals. Soldiers began manufacturing their own. The materials were abundant. The battlefields of France and Belgium were industrial zones before the war. Factories, workshops, and mines had been destroyed by artillery, leaving enormous quantities of metal debris. Steel rods, iron pipes, sections of railway track, industrial tools, and machinery components littered the landscape. Wood was available from destroyed buildings, furniture, and shattered trees. Nails, screws, bolts, and metal fragments could be scavenged from any ruined structure. The simplest trench weapon was a wooden club, typically fashioned from a chair leg, tool handle, or straight section of hardwood, roughly 18 to 24 inches long. The wood was weighted at one end, either by attaching a metal fixture or by driving nails through the striking end. The nails extended 3 to 6 inches beyond the wood surface. When swung with force, the club delivered both blunt trauma from the wood and penetrating trauma from the nails. Impact on the skull typically fractured bone on the first strike. Impact to the torso penetrated the ribs and damaged organs. The weapon required no training to use effectively. Any soldier strong enough to swing the club could deliver lethal force. More elaborate versions incorporated metal reinforcement. Soldiers brazed or wired steel plates to wooden shafts, creating mace-like weapons. Others used sections of pipe filled with concrete or lead to increase striking mass. One documented pattern used a steel ball bearing approximately 3 inches in diameter welded to a rod handle. The ball was studded with sharpened bolts threaded through drilled holes, creating a medieval flail adapted from industrial components. British soldiers called these weapons knob carries, borrowing the term from South African clubs. French soldiers called them massue. Germans called them Grabenkeulen, trench clubs. Regardless of the name, the function was identical: deliver maximum trauma with minimum noise. Production was entirely informal. Soldiers built trench weapons during rest periods behind the lines using materials scavenged from destroyed villages. Some units established informal workshops where men with metalworking experience fabricated weapons for their platoons. Battalion blacksmiths, when available, produced more sophisticated designs. Engineers constructed clubs using precision tools and measured weights. Infantry without access to workshops used whatever they could find. A notable example recovered from the Somme battlefield consisted of a steel entrenching tool handle with 9 railroad spikes driven through the blade end. The spikes were filed to points. The weapon weighed approximately 4 pounds. Testing conducted post-war indicated it could penetrate a German 1916 helmet at striking velocities achievable by an average soldier. Trench clubs saw extensive use during night raids, trench clearing operations, and close-quarters combat following artillery bombardments. British raiding doctrine by 1916 specifically called for soldiers carrying clubs rather than rifles when entering enemy trenches. The clubs were silent, did not require reloading, and could not malfunction. After-action reports from raids conducted by Canadian units at Vimy Ridge documented that over 60% of German casualties in captured trench sections showed blunt force trauma consistent with club weapons. Similar patterns appeared in German medical reports from the Eastern Front, where Russian soldiers used clubs extensively during winter fighting when firearms became unreliable in extreme cold. The psychological effect was substantial. Soldiers who survived club attacks reported extreme fear of night raids. The silence of the weapons meant that men died without warning. Sentries heard no rifle reports to alert them. The darkness of trenches combined with the close-range nature of club fighting meant victims often did not see their attackers. German doctrine by 1917 emphasized increased sentry density and improved lighting in forward trenches, specifically to counter Allied raiders armed with clubs. This redeployment of personnel reduced manpower available for other duties and created vulnerabilities elsewhere in defensive systems. German forces developed parallel weapons independently. The Nahkampfmittel, close combat tools, included clubs fitted with saw blade edges, maces constructed from grenade handles weighted with metal, and spiked knuckle dusters worn over gloves. One recovered German club used a section of trench periscope tube filled with concrete and capped with a sharpened steel cone. Austrian units on the Italian front fabricated clubs from artillery shell casings brazed to wooden handles. Ottoman forces in the Middle East used traditional Middle Eastern war clubs adapted with modern materials, combining ancestral weapon patterns with industrial components. American forces arriving in 1917 initially rejected trench clubs as barbaric. American military doctrine emphasized rifle marksmanship and considered close-quarters weapons primitive. This changed rapidly after the first American units entered trench combat at Cantigny in May 1918. American soldiers encountered German raiders armed with clubs and suffered casualties they could not prevent with rifles. Within weeks, American infantry were manufacturing their own clubs using patterns borrowed from British and French allies. One American design incorporated a cluster of .30-06 rifle cartridges welded together and fixed to a handle, creating a weighted striking surface surrounded by pointed brass. The clubs had significant limitations. The effective range was limited to arm's length. A soldier carrying only a club was defenseless against rifle fire at any distance beyond immediate contact. The weapons required physical strength to use effectively. Smaller or weaker soldiers could not generate sufficient striking force. The clubs also required soldiers to close with the enemy, placing the attacker at risk from enemy bayonets, knives, or pistols. Combat reports documented multiple instances of soldiers being shot while attempting to use clubs against armed opponents. The weapons were effective only when surprise and darkness eliminated the enemy's ability to respond with firearms. Perhaps more significant than tactical limitations was the institutional response. Military authorities across all armies were uncomfortable with the existence of trench clubs. The weapons represented a breakdown of modern warfare into hand-to-hand brutality that contradicted the image of professional, disciplined armies using precision weaponry. Official photographs of trench clubs exist, but were rarely published during the war. Training manuals acknowledged close-quarters weapons obliquely, but provided no formal instruction in their use. After the armistice, most clubs were deliberately destroyed rather than collected for museums or arsenals. Units were ordered to dispose of improvised weapons before demobilization. The clubs were to be left in France, buried in the same trenches where they had been used. A small number survived. Museums in Britain, France, Canada, and Germany hold examples, typically recovered from battlefield excavations decades after the war ended. The Imperial War Museum in London displays approximately 30 trench clubs representing various designs. Analysis of these weapons revealed construction techniques ranging from crude to sophisticated. Some show evidence of mass production with standardized dimensions and consistent manufacturing methods. Others are unique pieces reflecting individual soldiers' resourcefulness and available materials. One club in the museum's collection incorporates components from at least 7 different sources: a French railroad spike, German barbed wire, a British entrenching tool handle, a Belgian industrial bolt, and unidentified metal fragments. Modern testing of replica trench clubs conducted by military historians confirmed the weapon's effectiveness. A nail-studded club striking a ballistic gelatin head analog at velocities consistent with combat use produced skull fractures and penetrating trauma matching injuries documented in period medical reports. The club delivered approximately 2,400 foot-pounds of energy to the target, comparable to the muzzle energy of contemporary rifle cartridges, but concentrated into a much smaller impact area. The penetrating nails created wound channels that were invariably fatal when striking the skull or neck, and frequently fatal when striking the torso. Trench clubs disappeared from military inventories after 1918 because the conditions that created them disappeared. Trench warfare ended. Subsequent conflicts emphasized mobility, mechanization, and engagement at range. No major army after 1918 trained soldiers in close-quarters weapons beyond the bayonet and knife. The clubs became historical curiosities, examples of how industrial warfare could devolve into violence that differed little from medieval combat despite the presence of machine guns, artillery, and chemical weapons. The soldiers who built them and used them rarely spoke of them after returning home. The clubs represented a type of killing that was difficult to reconcile with the narrative of modern, civilized warfare. Men who had fired rifles at distant enemies could claim detachment. Men who had beaten other men to death with nail-studded clubs in the darkness could claim nothing. The weapons themselves were the evidence, and so the weapons were destroyed. What remains are fragments, preserved not because they represent technological achievement, but because they represent what technology could not prevent. Soldiers armed with rifles that could kill at 800 meters still needed clubs to kill at arm's length. The most advanced armies in human history still required their men to fight with weighted sticks in the mud.